And Chair McAllister, you will start with move back into regular board meeting.
Yes, I will.
Thank you very much.
May I ask a quick question? Do we have to enter another Teams meeting or just another board doc?
No, just stay right here. Just another board docs meeting, your public session board docs.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Chair McAllister, you are live.
Thank you very much, Lisa, and good evening, everyone. Good evening, trustees. We are now into moving into back into the regular board meeting, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this meeting of March the 24th, 2021, and I'll call the meeting to order. And I will ask Derek to play our national anthem. Are we doing the anthem tonight, Ms. Workman?
Yes, we are, as far as I know.
Unfortunately, I had to switch computers and I don't have it on this computer tonight, but I'll make sure in the future that I do have it.
Okay, thank you very much. There's no problem there. So, Director, I would ask you to take roll call for the regular meeting of March 24th.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen of the board. This is our roll call for our session of 24 March 2021. Trustee Barry.
Present.
Trustee Cram.
Present.
Trustee Danaher.
Present.
Trustee Jacobs.
Present.
Trustee McPherson.
Present.
Chair McAllister.
Present.
Trustee McRae.
Present.
Trustee McDonald.
Present.
Trustee Parisian.
Present.
Trustee Schooler.
Present.
Trustee Swan.
Present.
Trustee Evans. Trustee Hughes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You have quorum this evening.
Thank you very much, Director. I would ask you at this point if you have any comments in your role as Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, it's my pleasure to bring to your attention that we have a couple of milestones that we passed during this past few days. First of all, Mr. Chair, as you know, it has been a full year since the Upper Canada District School Board, and indeed all school boards in Ontario, were affected by a lockdown and school closure a year ago, March 13th, 2020 to be exact. And our staff have done an absolute tremendous job to serve students and to support families. As well, Mr. Chair, I wanted to also recognize that we are continuing to plan for the next school year. We brought a report to last month's board meeting, as you know, and also bring another report to the board this evening to further the discussion and to highlight how we are planning for the next school year, if you can believe it, Mr. Chair, for September 2021-22. As well, Mr. Chair, we had an important meeting involving 4 different school districts and the Kemptville campus last Friday, where we were assembling the process in which we are going to be operating and supporting the apprenticeship program for diesel mechanics on the Kemptville campus, which you know, as Mr. Chair and members of the trustees will know, that the Upper Canada District School Board is the lead partner supporting that dialogue. and supporting that program implementation. We'll be bringing to the board later this spring a full presentation to update the board on the progress and what we are projecting in terms of the liftoff, which will of course be in September, the types of work that's underway in terms of admissions planning, registration of students, and of course the curriculum delivery and program planning beyond that. So Mr. Chair, lastly, I should mention that we're now in the throes of staffing for next year. It's a significant annual process. It's informed by our collective agreements, of course, with our different labor groups. And with that comes additional work and insight that we need from our principals, vice principals, and our senior team. So my hat's off to them, knowing that it's a very detailed process. It goes for literally months until it's concluded. And it's important because we want to make sure we have our staff fully addressed as a way of planning and preparing for our next academic year. So members of the board will know that we are in the thick of that, and further updates to follow once we've concluded our staffing process. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you very much, Director. I have two comments. I'm sure, trustees, that you have all learned about Trustee Robin Ryle's passing earlier today. And as chair of the Upper Canada District School Board, I have sent my sincere condolences to his wife Kathy and sons Matt, Tom, and Eamon, and their families on his passing. He was a proud advocate of public education throughout his career as a teacher, a principal, and a trustee. And Robin served on the board of STEO with Trustee Danaher and me for the past 3 years. Robin was married to my first cousin, Kathy, and Robin and I attended high school together. So there is a family connection here. More importantly, as a friend, golfing buddy, and colleague, I will miss him. I extend my sympathy and support to his family and our trustee colleagues at the Catholic District School Board of Eastern Ontario. Robin will be deeply missed, and I ask you for a moment of silence. Thank you very much, trustees. The second item I wanted to comment on was with regard to the weekly chairs teleconference with Minister Stephen Lecce. This has been continued, has been an ongoing process since last March on a weekly basis. And the topics this week were the testing program, the waiver of the OSSLT test for this year, the final tranche of the ISAP funding, which is that program, that cooperative program between the feds and the province, the outlook for September, for which we are awaiting further direction, the vaccination program, and more. I did ask the following question, and the minister did respond. And my question was as follows, for your benefit. And I quote, my concern, as always, is the imminent release of the GSNs and September 2021. I appreciate your continued emphasis on parental student choice, yet we are concerned with the asynchronous digital and asynchronous non-digital options. Our concern is that these latter options are not serving the long-term benefits for students, and in fact, there's evidence that these options are being misused and misplaced. Could you please provide me with more clear pedagogical direction to me and to boards? So, end of quote. The minister did respond, and he indicated that he was aware of my concern and that more clear direction would be forthcoming to boards in the near future. That's really about all you can see and hear at this time. You will see later this evening in the agenda item 14, which is K-12 Program Delivery Program Planning Report, that this report references this very topic. And I look forward to a fulsome discussion on all items on this evening's agenda. So thank you very much. And at this point, I guess we are now going to move to item 1101, which is the digital presentations and the This Is Us videos, which will feature Pineview Public School and Van Cleek Hill District Collegiate. And I want to, as chair, maybe take some pride in the fact that while all schools are unique in our board and really, really great schools, none more so than Pineview Public School. So Pineview, Derek, would you take that away, please? Are we going to Van Cleek Hill first? I see Van Cleek Hill on the screen, so that is obviously what we are doing first. That's good. Take it away, Derek. Derek, we don't have any sound. At least I don't.
Chair McAllister, I have let Derek know that we have no sound currently.
Something.
I think, Derek, we're having a problem with the live feed on this one. Would the Pineview presentation be any different?
I'm having some audio.
All right, Derek, why don't we move to the next item, and we'll come back to you once I hear that you have this resolved either tonight or the next meeting. Okay?
I'll have sound with mine, John.
I beg your pardon?
I have sound with mine. I'm listening.
Yeah, it seems to be spotty, so we will, let's proceed if we could. And my apologies to Vantic Hill and to Pineview parents and students, but if it doesn't work tonight, we'll replay it at the next board meeting for sure. So thank you. This is all about COVID and about the technology of meeting online, and we are doing our very best, so thank you. So I'm going to move to 1301, which is a report of the Csba, the Ontario Public School Boards Association, and I'll turn this over to Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just want to check, make sure you can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect. So Board of Directors met for Csba on February 27th through Zoom. We were able to get a full day's worth of a meeting. What typically does take the full day, we've crammed it into to half a day. So one break in the middle, and we moved on and made sure we got some work done. So one of the benefits of I guess meeting through Zoom is that people can have their coffee and sit on their couch while they're meeting early Saturday morning. So we were able to accomplish quite a bit. A lot of information is provided. So the report is in front of you. I want to go over a couple of things with the trustees tonight, just to make sure that they zero in and take a look at some of the links potentially. So each one of our reports, we also get, from a financial standpoint, we get updates on B and SB memos. They also put the links in so that we can go in and reference those B and SB memos. And sometimes it's good just to see what's being sent out through the ministry, and for trustees to see that. So the link is in the report. You can obviously go through and see some of the information that's released out to boards. We did through our financial update. We also went through some of the information that was as a result of the federal financial funding that was provided. So the federal Safe Return to Class Fund, the funds went through. It's encapsulated in a B memo for 2021, and the details were there. There was a breakdown that was provided to trustees as well. So you'll see that there on the following page, a breakdown of how the funds were to be used and utilized. Of that, 50 million to deal with HEPA filters, 64.55 to support health and safety, 5 million to address transportation related cost pressures, 10 million to support school nutrition through the Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, 2 million to support summer learning opportunities, 60 million to support online learning, which appears most of it has gone to TVO, 80 million to support devices and connectivity to ensure students can access learning, 6.45 to support equity initiatives, 33 for future pandemic related needs, and 10 million to support student mental health. Some of that funds were distributed to the Kids Help Phone program. We did get an update on the Indigenous Education Council, our Indigenous Trustee Council. Information is there. They did meet several times since our last Board of Directors meeting and have been active in ensuring that they're able to bring the voice of Indigenous trustees, Indigenous students to the table. Also, legislative updates, another big item typically that we go through, talking about all of the different legislation and regulations that are coming forward or have come forward through the government. And typically we would see those also come through in an update on a weekly basis, or I guess as needed, but at a minimum, usually it's every week. If there's activity going on, when the House is risen and there's not much activity, we don't see those reports coming through. There is a number of legislative pieces that are put forward here. Bill 216, Bill 172, Bill 246, and Regulation 707, which relates to student trustees. Also, yeah, sorry, 46397, which is changes, or I guess not changes, but an extension of the electronic meeting and meeting attendance. It originally had a timeline on it, so it was extended to allow for the electronic meetings to continue. And Regulation 176, which is the teacher qualification, and Regulation 298. We did talk about, even though it was finance, we talked about GSNs in a separate situation. So Csba on an annual basis solicits information from boards and trustees to put a plan together and put a submission together. And in January, we submitted that that document to the ministry to help with the response to what would be required for boards and how the province could potentially shape the GSNs and how it would move forward with helping fund boards. The submission is a link in the document, so you can go through and take a look at that. The spring budget, when we met, was to be delivered on the 31st, so it's a little advanced. So we're hoping that GSNs will come soon based on the budget being released. So typically there's a 1-2 week lag of when the budget's released to when technical papers start to be released to board administration staff and are able to articulate what that means for boards. We also, in the past, have talked and we've done some advice, or sorry, not advice, I'm thinking of my work, some advocacy days where we would attend Queen's Park and meet with members of provincial parliament and meet with the government in particular to try and talk to them about Csba's agenda and making sure that the voice of students is heard and public schools is heard across the government and across the opposition parties. With that, we had to move to virtual days, so we've they provided a highlight to the board of directors on how that has happened and what we're going to be doing moving forward. We don't want to lose the opportunity to be engaged with our members, so we want to make sure that we still have those opportunities to have those advocacy days. The next piece, obviously talked about equity, diversity, inclusion, communication, government. Pieces that I want to talk about on the next page, future of education report. So as we know, obviously the pandemic, it's certainly magnified a number of issues across the province and individually in boards as well. So through the education program work team, they're creating a new discussion paper, a vision for learning and teaching in a digital age. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to put some concrete information into place and to see what we might be able to do on the future of education and how what we've learned through the pandemic to be able to look and evaluate on how we deliver education and how we can actually address student achievement, student well-being in various ways. As well, we talked about French as a second language. This is an ongoing report that comes to the board of directors. It's a FSL French second language labor market partnership. Judith Nyman acts on behalf of Csba on this one. The link there provides some information about the partnership and the project, and there is ongoing information around FSL in the province. You can see with the French FSL working group as well. We also have committed to having a children, youth, mental health, I'm going to use the word symposium, but it's not a symposium, on a biannual basis, biannual basis. And you'll see here that they did meet with the coalition on the 30th of November and looking at opportunities on how we can move forward with that and champion school mental health in Ontario and what the future design would look like as we move forward and deliver on those pieces. A bit of information as well on the de-streaming of math. So again, all the feedback was submitted to the ministry on the 5th of February. There is a sense of urgency to receive the curriculum as quickly as possible in order for school boards to be able to plan. You heard from the director earlier that the staffing process gets underway and has been underway, but starts to be solidified as we approach the month of April. So the sooner we have that, the better it is for what we would be looking at for September if it's to move forward as potentially planned. Csba as well is reviewing our internal workings. So we have something called Project Compass that is just reviewing our internal governance practices. If I can recall off memory, the last time we did this was probably well over 10 years ago. So it's an opportunity to be able to review and bring some information back to our directors and all the trustees at our annual general meeting. The work is really complex because we're looking at trying to ensure that we have a good system in place. We always kind of think we have it in the right spot and find the sweet spot, but we end up having a couple of tweaks here and there. So the plan is to do some work, but not to bring it to this year's AGM, but to bring it to the 2022 AGM. So the work will be a multi-year review and multi-year presentations coming forward. So they did provide a quick snapshot of the work that's been undertaken so far, but it's really very at the early stages and still in the planning process. CSBA update, we have the pleasure of having the president of CSBA as one of our trustees. In fact, one of our neighbors, Lori French at the Limestone District School Board. And Lori brings updates to OPSPA on what's happening across the country. You'll see some of the information that's listed here. One of the pieces that's not listed is around what's transpired in Manitoba. So you'll see that CSBA and OPSPA have advocated and been very vocal on the measures that the Manitoba provincial government have taken to eliminate trustees, eliminate school organizations as they are today. So they've been vocal on that aspect. I will say that CSBA and OPSPA AGM are both going to be virtual this year. So OPSPA's AGM is in the spring, in June, and CSBA will be in July. So they will be meeting virtually with different sessions that will be planned through a virtual format to come. That is my report, Mr. Chair, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Trustee McDonald. Are there questions? Are there any questions? Trustee McDonald, I have a question. And it's with regard to the French second language labor market partnership. As you know, we are heading into de-streaming of math in grade 9 in September 2021 for very good reasons. I'm wondering if there has been any discussion at the OPSPA table with regard to perhaps one strong, rich FSL program.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We haven't really had that discussion, but I can tell you that it may be part of a discussion. The work really is, a lot of the discussion is around finding qualified teachers to be able to teach the program. So I think what you may see is that as we move forward with the project and start to identify some of the items that are preventing or I guess allowing us to have robust programs in place and making sure that we have teachers for that, we may have to move to a different model. If the supply of teachers is still limited and we are having a hard time finding those teachers, then we may have to start looking at some things across the province. I think part of the issue though is that we have multiple levels of systems in the province of delivery of French, not only in public education boards, but in the other 3 publicly funded school boards. So, I think that creates an issue across the province. And so as we see funding being diverted to different boards, all trying to offer similar French delivery, but knowing that there is a shortage of teachers to be able to teach that, it may be one of the outcomes that come as a result of the work that's being done.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Trustees, do you have any questions of Trustee McDonald?
Please.
Go ahead, Trustee Barry.
Was there any discussion as to what will be done with the $60 million that went to TV Ontario?
So not with what went to TV Ontario. So the discussion really around the online learning aspect was, I would say, dismay and disappointment that it was funded to TVO. There is a belief and a feeling that boards of education would be better suited to deliver online learning or a remote learning process, and using the skills and the tools that we have available to us for ensuring that we're matching the curriculum and delivering that program. That was the general consensus. There isn't, I mean, it's part of a discussion that's ongoing, obviously, with Csba and staff whenever they do talk to ministry and trying to get an understanding of what's coming through as a result of the funding going to TVO. But there were no answers at this session in February that we knew what the plan was or what the expected deliverable would be.
I have a question, Trustee Swan.
Trustee Swan, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, earlier in your statements, you said that listening to students, and I know our students, at least in our board, said that they were really interested in the quadmester model and that it was working for many of them. Is Csba taking any position on this?
So one of the things that occurred the week prior to the board of directors meeting was a regional meeting, and through the regional meeting, there was an opportunity for input, and it was the ability for trustees to share what's working, what do they like, what's there. I think it was shared by myself that I think students like quadmester, but we also identify that there are some obstacles in the way of completing that and moving forward, and that it needed to have a more of a provincial level view if that were to be continued. So the end result of what occurred at the regional meeting was encompassed within our minutes, but then there was also an opportunity for a committee to come forward, not just around quadmester, but around delivery of education. So that was still forthcoming. There was no finalization on that update. But I will say that it's mixed across the trustees, across the province. I think there's feedback that the quadmester, some have moved to a different model altogether than quadmester. So there's various delivery models out there, but I think what they've established is that what we were able to accomplish as a result of the pandemic is one thing, and really what we're focusing on is what does the future look like, right? So what is the learning that we're able to take away, and part of that will be I guess the division or the scheduling of classes. And so what does that outcome look like? We'll have to see when that gets finalized and how the report moves forward. But hopefully there's an opportunity for us to have more of a robust discussion across the province about delivery of education and what's good for kids and what's good for boards to be able to move forward and deliver.
Trustee McDonald, question for me. I noticed in the press that there has been quite a bit of consternation amongst other boards with regard to the fact that they have had to change and adjust and modify programs, whereas in our board we have not had to do that because we have had a consistent model right from day one. Is there any progress on this, or was there any discussion on this?
Not so much at the board of directors. There was a bit of discussion around it at a regional meeting the week prior. I certainly highlighted the success that we've had in being able to transition into and allow for parents and students to choose a model that best suits them based on the circumstances that are developing. And many of the boards kind of, they've broken the egg and started to scramble it, so it's hard to put the egg back together, and they've created a situation where they really didn't know how to get out of it. And so I think what they've done and what they're going to do is continue the year as it is, but the entry points have caused problems across boards when you have commitments that are required that you're either in a synchronous digital format, or you're in a classroom in a virtual school versus an in-person school. And so we didn't talk specifically about finances, but we did talk about the difficulty of the transitioning from one to the other and having only the entry points. And I think hopefully that is part of what we would see on the future of education as well coming forward. I think I've highlighted as much as possible the model that we had, and I think trustees, certainly in the Eastern region, had paid attention and listened, and I think they see the benefits that we've seen right from day one.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. Are there any further questions?
Mr. Chair, John McCrae.
Go ahead, Trustee McCrae.
Thank you. We're having kind of a generalized discussion about where education's going. There's an article in today's Globe and Mail about a product or a platform called Disco, which is not like a discotheque, but it's about some software or a platform that's the equivalent of Shopify was to retail what will be to education, so it might be something the trustees would want to check out, and David, perhaps something that may come up in the future, because it's something that would empower teachers to produce content outside of any institution. So it might be worth noting at your level. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For sure, I haven't seen the article, but certainly good to know, and I'll look at that. I will say that I know, in particular with Upper Canada, the ability and the relationship that we have with Microsoft, we've got some pretty neat set of tools that are available for teachers, and I hope that if there are things there that will be of benefit to delivering education, that we'll examine those and certainly bring them forward, and make sure that that's part of my messaging when we meet again as a board of directors as well.
Right on.
Thank you, Trustee McDonald. If there are no further questions, there will be an opportunity to delve into this a bit further under 1404, which is the program delivery planning for 2021-22. So I would like to move at this point to 1302, which is the report of the Policy Committee update number 6 to March 22nd, 2021, on today actually. And I will have ask Trustee Cram if you will introduce this, then I will read the motion, and then we will have discussion.
Thank you, Chair. The Policy Committee had a special meeting on Monday of this week to discuss the new policy that we're going to introduce tonight. It comes as a result of last October, the Ministry of Education released a PPM 165 that made sure that boards of education had a new policy in place by March 31st, hence the reason for having the policy come forward tonight, because they had revoked Regulation 274. And tonight you're going to have Trustee McDonald and Trustee Parisian introduce that motion that you will read and perhaps speak to it. And I know we'll get the support of Superintendent Ferguson in addressing the new policy. He and Jennifer McDonald had a lot to do with helping to develop that policy, and Director Sliwa as well. So at this point, if you want to introduce the motion, and I'm sure Trustee McDonald and Parisian would be speaking to it.
Thank you very much, Trustee Cram. I have a motion moved by Trustee McDonald, seconded by Trustee Parisien, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve Policy 209, Employee Hiring Practices Policy, effective March 24th, 2021. So I will turn this over to Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Trustee Cram, thank you as well. What you see before you is a policy that is really, it's a new policy, but it's a policy that's replacing a regulation. Typically, you don't see that, but what this is doing is replacing what was in place to, I guess, deal with what was perceived to be some issues in the province a number of years ago with Regulation 274. Sorry, it was 274? Yeah. And so what we have before you is a policy that will provide the guidelines and the high level view of how we would be hiring teachers and individuals across the board at a level. So obviously principals, superintendents, and directors sit in a different platform. But what we would be doing is having this policy to address that hiring process. And so there are specific components in this that deal with teachers, but the policy is encompassing of all employees. And I think it's an opportunity for us to really address a best practice that we've actually always had, but now we're formalizing it and putting it into place on what we would be seeing as a policy. This was what we were doing prior to the regulation in place, and this is just a return to what we would be doing moving forward. There are cross-references and legal references that are in the policy, and you see that it does encompass quite a bit of information here as it relates to legislation and regulation, but also our cross-reference policies. There will be subsequent procedures that administration will undertake and use in the process, but the policy does meet the requirements of the ministry. And the policy is sound to ensure that we are putting in place a fair and equitable process for hiring individuals. That's all I have, unless Trustee Parisian has any other comments.
Yeah. Nobody. You have or Trustee McDonald, sorry, you
Trustee Parisien is not coming.
Everything.
I didn't hear all what Trustee Parisien had to say, but I gather that she is in favor as a mover or as a seconder of this motion. So, trustees, do you have any other questions that you would like to ask of Trustee McDonald on this policy?
Chair, it might be worthwhile hearing Superintendent Ferguson on the policy itself and how it may affect what's going to happen in the future.
Sure, good point. Go ahead, Superintendent Ferguson.
Through you, Mr. Chair, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So yes, the trustees have done an excellent job of summarizing where we're at here. As folks will take note, prior to Reg 274 being implemented in the province back in 2012, principals did have the freedom to hire the people as contract and long-term occasional in their building based on the needs of their school and people they thought were a good fit and what was in the best interest of students. After Reg 274, we did move to a process and a policy that required people be hired based solely on seniority. So certainly this is a welcome change for our principals in our system. Looking forward to being able to hire again based on people's abilities, to add some diversity, and to hire based solely on the needs of the students and what's best for our students. Again, the trustees have summarized things quite well here. If you look at the policy 209 that we've created, you'll see, and as Trustee McDonald mentioned, PPM 165 relates to teachers, but we've broadened this so that it encompasses other employee groups as well. And then specifically in the second paragraph, though, then we talk about when hiring teachers, which again is what PPM 165 relates to specifically. And I'll just note that the language that we've used here comes directly from the PPM 165, which we are required as a board to follow. And in consultation with other boards and other HR superintendents around the province, everyone has something very similar to what we proposed here tonight. So we'll be very much in line with PPM 165 and with other boards around the province. And you'll see that it says here, providing the best possible program as determined by the principal and considering applicants demonstrated, and it lists several here: teaching commitment, experience or time spent in a particular school. That part would speak to, if you have someone that's been an occasional teacher, knows the students, knows the community is the right fit, that would be something would be considered. Suitable for a particular assignment, valuing applications, additional experiences, skills, backgrounds, lived and work experience. Responding to school and board priorities based on clearly defined criteria, including qualifications. And the last thing that we mentioned here is that hiring requirements and selection criteria will be clearly laid out and publicly available, and that we would obviously review this policy and monitor and amend it as required. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Superintendent Ferguson. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, I would ask you to cast your ballot, please.
I'm in favor, Barry.
That motion has been carried. So we are now going to move. Thank you, trustees, and thank you, Superintendent Ferguson, and Trustee Cram, Trustee McDonald, and Trustee Parizan for your work on the policy committee. We are now going to move to 1303, which is the report of the Special Education Advisory Committee. I will turn this over to Vice Chair McPherson.
Right, thank you. Ciac met again on the 2nd of March, again via Microsoft Teams. Our next meeting will be on April the 6th, 2021, again via Microsoft Teams. At our meeting on the 2nd, we went over to Parent Advisory Committee on Ciac, and basically it was a provincial survey done involving, well, parent associations, anybody essentially that wanted to respond. They went to all English boards in Ontario and 18 different local associations. One of the requirements was that the Ciac chairs would share the results with the Ciac members, and that's exactly what we were doing. We had a fair amount of discussion on it. On a scale of 1 to 10, I'd say we're probably easily up there in a 7.5 to an 8. The one thing that did come out of the discussion, and as a project for next year, we're looking to developing a locally based Ciac handbook, which is essentially basically a compilation of recommendations and guidelines as to how to be a proper and successful Ciac. Similar in line to what we developed a few years ago with the parental guides to Spec Ed. Next part of our evening, we had the superintendent's report, and I want to second the first bullet here. Superintendent Perry recognized the incredible work the school's staff have done and central staff done to create a safe and welcoming environment for our students. We've had what is best described as a teeter-totter year, up and down, and I have to second that feeling that we owe an awful lot to a very hardworking staff. We are looking at the second term IEPs, which probably should have gone out yesterday. We did have a report on a rather exciting project, the Early Years Collaborative Project Learning Partners. We now have them working in 9 schools supporting kindergarten educators. And we are actually going to have a presentation from that group, I believe, on the 6th of April, if I've been reading my agenda right. This is a collaborative endeavor, and I think we're going to look at more of those as we go along. We also made note of some PD that our staff are receiving. We have 16 teachers enrolled in communication, teaching children with autism. That was a very interesting presentation. As well, we have been working with an Indigenous perspective, the ripple effect of resiliency, and this was by Monique Gray Smith. And that basically is that in a nutshell, and either myself or hopefully Superintendent Perry, who knows more about spec ed than I do, will be able to answer any of your questions.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Trustees, do you have any questions about this report? Hearing none. Vice Chair McPherson, I want to commend you for your ongoing commitment and enthusiasm. It is infectious, and I look forward to your next report. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We are moving to 1401, which is the Upper Canada District School Board's Equity and Inclusion Plan Update, March 24th, 2021. And I will ask Director Sliwa to introduce Director Coombs, I believe, who is presenting this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. As you know, Mr. Chair, the board has a variety of plans, purpose of which is to move the organization forward in its aspirations and commitments to public education. This is certainly the case with regards to the Equity and Inclusion Plan. What's coming to the board this evening is an update on the plan that the board approved in 2018, and in that 2-year plan, staff are bringing an update on what is the end result, the execution of those key elements, key factors that inform the plan, and also to bring an update on next steps for the revitalization of the next generation of that plan, moving forward for the next 2 or 3 years as well. So Mr. Coombs will provide some insights about that, and recognizing as well that this is a critical time in North America, across the world, with the focus on equity and inclusion being heightened, and a reckoning right now globally about anti-racism, and to revisit all kinds of practices and approaches that are used in all organizations. This plan has become more and more important, obviously, to our board and all publicly funded school boards across North America. So I'll turn this over to Superintendent Coombs then, Mr. Chair, and look forward to any questions that the trustees may raise as a result of the report.
Feel free to go ahead, Trustee Coombs.
Mr. Chair, it's Stephen here. We'll just check to make sure Superintendent Coombs is still linked in here, so I'll just see where we're at. Just a moment. So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Coombs may have been bumped out of the meeting here. I'll just do a quick follow-up, and if you wouldn't mind, Mr. Chair, if it pleases the committee, that we would continue on in the agenda and then circle back to Mr. Coombs in the next report.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So we're going to move to 1402, which is the financial forecast number 2, and I will turn this over to you, Director, and then Superintendent Hobbs. Is that the way you want it to work?
Sure thing, Mr. Chair, that would be perfect. So, ladies and gentlemen of the board, as you know, the board has a number of check-ins with regards to the financial forecast of the board since the budget was passed last July. This is financial forecast number 2. Number 1 was delivered to you, as you know, Mr. Chair, in January, and at that time, the board was projecting a deficit of $2.9 million. We're pleased to bring tonight's report to the board. The current forecast brings a improved projection in terms of the board's finances leading up to the end of this fiscal year, August 2021. And I know that Executive Superintendent Hobbs and the finance team have been working diligently to assemble all this complex information and bring it together in a hopefully a very comprehensive way that you'll find informative. And then we'll see what kind of questions folks may have. Over to you, Superintendent Hobbs.
1 second here. Thank you. So can you hear me? I'm just switching back and forth between my PowerPoint and my slideshow. So Mr. Chair,
yes,
you can hear me and you can see my deck?
Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you. And just before I like to start, I'd like to take the director to task for giving away the punchline for my presentation. I'd like to deliver the good news, but he couldn't resist, and that's perfectly fine. But I'd like to walk you through the logic leading up to that sort of last page of the novel. Again, my privilege to bring you financial forecast number 2. As the director indicated, the previous one was given about a little over a month ago in January. And again, really, we do 3 financial forecasts each year, but really there's 4 because, as we know, the original budget that we typically pass in the June timeframe for the upcoming year is really forecast 0 as to how we see things going. So tonight, I'm pleased to give you a bit of a look as to how we see the rest of the year unfolding. So the next slide, what we'd like to cover this evening is a brief background and an executive summary, if you will, for the results. The second piece we'll do is walk you through some of the detail of our forecast for this year and the underlying logic that informs why we have modified our forecast compared to the last one you saw in the January timeframe. And finally, a brief summary. By now, you're well acquainted with this slide, which we like to use to show you the sort of complexity of the work that we're dealing with. At any given time, as you know, we're working on 2 or 3 years of financial results. And so really, I think the first thing that's important for us to recognize is that in the fall timeframe, oftentimes what we're doing is closing out the previous fiscal year. And that culminates in the audited financial statements, which really represent a definitive view of our financial position at the end of the previous fiscal year. So in the November-December timeframe, board passed our audited financial statements for the 1920 fiscal year, which ended in August of 2020. And at that point, one of the key financial metrics that we look at is our accumulated surplus, and that really represents, every year we may generate a small surplus or a small deficit. Over time, that accumulates, and at the end of last year, 1920, we had an accumulated surplus available for compliance. Moving on from those audited financial statements, a lot of time we're spending working on the current year. And while we put a budget in place in June and we do financial forecasts throughout the year, really what we're doing throughout the year is monitoring and adjusting to the changing conditions that we encounter throughout the year, and then modifying our forecasts in response to those adjustments and environmental changes. And that's where you see these 3 financial forecasts, which are every single time we bring one forward, they are our best estimate based on the information that we have available and our best estimates of future environmental changes as to how we're going to end the financial year. And then, of course, we're also starting to talk now, as the director indicated earlier, we're already in the planning process for the upcoming school year, and that'll culminate in the May-June timeframe of a formal budget to the Ministry of Education for the upcoming year. But right now, we're at financial forecast number 2 in the top bar. A little bit of background. So on July 15th, just to give you a flavor for the evolution, on July 15th, we presented a budget and trustees approved a budget for the 2020-21 school year, and that projected an in-year surplus for the 2020-21 school year of $200,000 or $0.2 million. What we also projected is at the end of that, if we took that $200,000 surplus at the end of August 31st, 2021, that would result in an accumulated surplus for the board throughout our entire history of around $11 million. Since September 2020, as you know, we've provided a series of presentations, and as we all know, this year has been more perhaps volatile in some respects than others in terms of how things have changed. Many times things have changed. We've been looking at risks and what the risks of the financial picture could be, but we've also been very fortunate to have the financial support from the Ministry of Education that almost as quickly as we've been able to identify risks this year, the ministry has been able to provide some sort of financial support to help mitigate the impact of those risks or events. In January 2021, as you know, we were presented with the first financial forecast. That was our revised estimates. And things got worse, to be candid, between budget, our original budget, where we projected a $200,000 surplus. In January, we are projecting a $2.9 million deficit. That would be our ending position at the end of the year. And of course, when we end the year in a deficit, that has the effect of drawing down our accumulated surplus balance. So that would have gone from $11 million down to $8.2 million. Now what we're doing is providing a reforecast. And though you may think that things can't possibly have changed that much since January, being what it is this year with that especially sort of topsy-turvy year and rapid change of pace, things have changed quite significantly, actually, as the director pointed out. So the executive summary for this evening is that we're anticipating an improvement in our year-ending operational deficit. So instead of right now, instead of a $2.9 million deficit as we projected in the January timeframe, we're projecting only a deficit of $1.1 million based upon the funding information we've received to date, as well as a prudent estimate of the financial risk. Should we end the year with a $1.1 million deficit, and the reason why I put it that way is because we are still about halfway through the fiscal year, and therefore there's lots of things that can happen and uncertainties that can happen. But should that $1.1 million deficit come to fruition, the board would remain compliant with all the ministry requirements for our finances, and that $1.1 million deficit would have the effect of drawing down our accumulated surplus available for compliance down to about $10 million. So instead of having $11 million as we started out the year, that $1.1 million deficit would erode that accumulated surplus available for compliance down to $10 million in total. As previously reported, of course, the pandemic continues to be a source of considerable volatility. Trustees obviously are aware, based on the conversation you just had about Csba and some of the considerations there. Lots of information in the news about outbreaks and a potential third wave and how that affects us operationally have yet to be determined. So we expect that there will continue to be improvements, and there may be very well continue to be financial pressures that are caused by the ongoing environmental fluctuations that we're seeing. And our next, of course, we'll continue monitoring and adjusting, and we'll bring you back the final financial forecast for this year in June, financial forecast number 3. A little bit about the financial forecast detail. You've kind of heard the punchline, or you've heard the plot twist at the end. Instead of a $2.9 million deficit in our last forecast, projecting currently a $1.1 million deficit at year end. How do we get there? Well, first of all, I think one of the things we've historically done is given you an updated flavor for our enrollments. And what we're showing here is a comparison from our enrollments at financial forecast number 1, which is in January, to now. So as you'll recall, trustees, there was quite a big shift in enrollment from our original budget that we passed on July 15th and that hit us in the October timeframe, over 400 students lower than what our original projections were. And of course, as you know, especially with the quadmester system and some of those changes that we have as people move between learning modes, what happens is there is probably a little bit more volatility in terms of our enrollments this year than we have seen in previous years. So the good news is that our elementary ADE, or average daily enrollment, has held absolutely steady since our 2021 financial forecast. But secondary, there's been a bit of a drop there of 121 students, and primarily coming out of TR Leger, actually. And then in terms of our adult day continuous ed and summer school, we're up about 34 students there. And again, predominantly driven by students switching between different learning modalities as circumstances dictate for them across the organization. And so the question is, how does, I guess, that have an impact, or how does that play into our ongoing financials? Because the obvious, I think for those of you who've been around, the obvious sort of correlation that we're used to is that if enrollment drops, so does our funding, and that creates financial pressure. So the financial forecast, again, just to recap, in January, on January 27th, at our last presentation, we were showing a deficit of $2.9 million. And the slide I'm on now, unfortunately, the Teams presentation has blocked my my page numbering. So while I would normally be calling out the slide numbers, the screen for Teams is down in the corner. I'm blocking it. But the title of this slide is Financial Forecast. And what you see here is that in the column 2020-21 financial forecast number 1, January 27th, 2021, we were showing a $2.9 million deficit. Revenues of $389.5 million against total expenses for compliance of $392.4 million, resulting in a deficit of $2.9 million. And trustees that sort of have the numbers burned into their brains from the original budget will recall that our original budget that we passed in July had estimated revenues of about $382 million. So even between July and this time, January 27th, 2021, you can see our revenues have jumped up by about $7 million, virtually entirely attributable to additional funding supports that have been provided by the Ministry of Education and the federal government to support the COVID response. But our expenses jumped up even more to $392.4 million. The really important column for this evening, of course, is the next column, which is highlighted in blue. And the title of that column is 2020-21 Financial Forecast Number 2, delivered on March 24th, 2021. And what you see again is that our revenue has crept up a little bit by about $4 million to $393.1 million. And our, excuse me, our expenses for compliance have crept up also to $394.2 million. And because that gap has narrowed, we now are projecting a deficit of $1.1 million. And so, excuse me, essentially what's happened between January 27th and now is that our projected deficit position has improved by a total of $1.8 million. And the question would be, of course, where does that deficit, or where does that improvement come from? So some of the improvement is a reduction in the main contributors table down below. Some of it is a reduction in a COVID-related deficit. And really what we're doing here, and you will recall from some of my presentations on COVID-related expenses and funding, you'll recall that we had all kinds of expenses that we were anticipating for the COVID response, which ran the gamut from increased custodial supports to increased teacher sick leave or accommodation costs, or the cost to buy PPE that was not provided through the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services. And by and large, many of those expenses that are related to the COVID response have been covered by government funding that we're grateful for, but some hadn't. And predominantly what you're seeing here is that as we've been looking at the PPE that we've had and related supplies that we've had to buy ourselves because they weren't supplied through the Ministry of Government and Consumer Services, the burn rate that we're seeing through schools is lower than what was initially the case in the fall. Schools just aren't using as much of it, and so we've adjusted our projection accordingly, and that results in an improvement of $1.2 million. So the biggest improvement that you're seeing, biggest contributor to that $1.8 million projected improvement to our operating results at the year end is really driven by a lower than expected or projected consumption rate of PPE in an amount of $1.2 million. I think another thing that's important to recognize here is line number 2 under the main contributors, which is a net change in GSN funding and tuition fees. So on the previous slide, I pointed out at the tail end of my remarks that generally speaking, a reduction in enrollments is accompanied by a reduction in funding. And yet what we've seen here is that hasn't been the case. In fact, we're net about $100,000 to the good, and that's largely a result of further enrollment stabilization funding that has been provided by the Ministry of Education to support those lower than expected enrollments. So whatever funding we would have normally lost has been supplemented and slightly more than supplemented, in fact, to the tune of $100,000. So that's contributed to the improvement. And then the change in transportation surplus. So we were locked down in January with a little transportation occurring, and what ended up happening is we have, of course, with fewer buses running, there are some savings there to the tune of about $600,000. And, you know, I think that the important thing that our friends at STEO will certainly remind us is that this transportation in general is especially volatile this year because you have some moving parts, not just the busing requirements that may fluctuate depending on the operational state of our schools, but we also have fuel prices that we're mindful of that are experiencing some volatility. And the government will, from time to time, adjust our financials at the end of the year based on the actual fuel costs. So we really try to, while we factor that into our projection, we do so with a measure of caution, recognizing that probably line 3 with regard to transportation, really until we get close to the end of the year, it's hard to have a really super high level of confidence that things are going to turn out as we initially project. And then, of course, our catch-all or our miscellaneous other changes column represents, generally speaking, about $100,000 unfavorable change, and that's really driven by, I think, changes in departmental forecasts about what how their budgets are going to end up in the course of a year. But you know, while it's lower in the grand scheme of things with the numbers we're talking about, it's not anything really especially to be worried about, and certainly within the realm of adjustment if we had to adjust. So moving on to the next slide, this is our projected compliance status as at August 31st, 2021. So again, the purpose of this entire presentation is to look out into the future and make a bit of a projection as to how we're going to end the year 2020-21 from a financial standpoint. So as it stands right now, of course, we're forecasting an in-year surplus or / deficit for compliance purposes. So it will be a deficit of $1.1 million compared to the $2.9 million that we were forecasting in January. That's our best estimate that we can put together right now. This year, as you know, the ministry provides us, we can't run an infinitely large deficit, of course, in year. The ministry has a definition of compliance, and that really is composed of 2 parts. Is they give us a threshold, which represents the maximum deficit we can run. Generally speaking, that's 1% of our gross operating revenue. So you would generally think that would be around, if our overall operating revenue is about $380 million, 1% of that is about $3.8 million, which means we could run a $3.8 million deficit and still be in compliance, according to the ministry. Trustees will recall back in August of 2020 as one of the measures that the ministry provided us to provide greater flexibility in our response to COVID was they allowed us the ability for this year to run a 2% deficit for this year as a measure to help us achieve financial flexibility in our response. So that means this year, technically speaking, we could run a $6.7 million deficit and still be in compliance as long as we have the funds in our accumulated surplus available for compliance that, you know, at the end of the 1920 fiscal year, which we do, to cover that. And we do have that and we could cover that. The question is whether or not we want to or whether we could to do that. But right now, we're obviously well within, with a $1.1 million projected deficit for this year. We're well within that compliance threshold. So the next slide talks a little bit about how our accumulated surplus available for compliance is going to end up the year at August 31st. So trustees will recall that at the end of the 1920 fiscal year, we have the auditors in and they provide us the definitive financial statements representing our financial position at the end of August 31st, 2020. And at that point, our financial position includes an accumulated surplus or a deficit, but in our case, it was a surplus. And that represents the sum total of all the annual surpluses and deficits we had accumulated throughout our history up to that point. Similarly, at the end of this fiscal year that we're in right now, if we were to run an in-year surplus, that in-year surplus would get added to our accumulated surplus going forward. And conversely, if we run a deficit in this year, that deficit will be subtracted from the accumulated surplus this year. And then we'll start another financial cycle in the upcoming year. So in addition to projecting a $1.1 million operating deficit for this upcoming year, we're also trying to project for trustees, what would that mean for our accumulated surplus projection at August 31st, 2021? And trustees will recall that the surplus available for compliance is composed of three major parts. The first part is our operating accumulated surplus available for compliance. And that is really any kind of surplus funds that we have that are really unrestricted in terms of our ability to use them or apply them in different areas of our board. The second piece of that surplus available for compliance is what we call the total internally appropriated surplus available for compliance. And that consists of funds that the board itself has earmarked in past history for specific purposes. And that largely really for us consists of school budgets, school operating budgets that schools would use to pay for supply teachers or those kinds of things that they would use to operate. At the end of the year, schools being part of the larger board, whatever is unused in their budgets roll up to the larger board's financial statements. And that represents probably the bulk of the internally appropriated surplus available for compliance. Still there for use at the board's discretion, but it has a designated use. The final and third piece of the surplus is the total surplus is the externally appropriated surplus that is unavailable for compliance. And this really is the part of the total board surplus that we cannot touch because it is externally appropriated. In other words, it is mandated for us that we must maintain this surplus and we cannot use it for our own purposes. And largely speaking, that consists of a surplus that has been built up over the years to fund a future retirement benefit liability that all boards to one extent or another have. And this is really around retirement gratuities that were phased out in the 2012, I believe, timeframe. And but because we will still owe employees that gratuity in the future, that's considered to be a liability, and therefore we need to have a balancing fund for that. So this is really what that part of the surplus is for. But really, strictly speaking, the first 2 or 3 rows are what's of interest to trustees. And what you see is that as of September 1st, 2020 or August 31st, 2020, we had about an $11.1 million total accumulated surplus available for compliance. So I'm looking at row 3 here, the blue highlighted row. The projection for this year is that we're going to end this year with a $1.1 million deficit, which you see. That would be what we're projecting as the financial results for 2020-21. And if that comes to fruition, as I said earlier, that would have the effect of drawing down that accumulated surplus available for compliance at the end of the year, leaving us with $10 million. Again, really what's important here is that we know the 11.1 for sure, because that's been confirmed as part of our audited financial statements representing our financial position at the start of the year. The $1.1 million deficit, while we are basing that on the best available information that we have to date, nonetheless, it is still an estimate and there's considerable uncertainty, but that would leave us with a $10 million total accumulated surplus available for compliance. This is a slide that very quickly just shows you what we see as the evolution. So at the budget time, we were projecting an $11 million surplus available for compliance in the original estimates. As of financial forecast number 1, our total accumulated surplus for compliance, because we are projecting a $2.9 million in-year deficit, that would have had the effect of drawing that surplus down to $8.2 million. And now you see things starting to get better, because now we're only projecting a $1.1 million deficit. That would leave us with more money in the accumulated surplus available for compliance at year end. And while we would like to think that that trajectory would continue, again, especially because of the nature of this year, there's still considerable uncertainty there. And we feel we'll be able to provide you an even better projection when we get closer to the next forecast in June. This represents our, again, multi-year financial plan. I think really what you see happening here is that if you look at the blue bars, the vertical blue bars here, what you see is that in 1920 we had the blue bar is quite a bit bigger than the orange bar. The orange bar is what we had originally projected our accumulated surplus to be in that year. The blue bar is what it actually turned out to be at year end. And the reason why the blue bar grew so much compared to what we had projected was really driven by the fact that we were in complete shutdown for a number of months that year and just didn't spend money on things like supply teachers and those kinds of things. So that lack of expenditure arising from the shutdown went directly to our accumulated surplus available for compliance. You see that bar gets a little shorter over in the next column to 2021, and that's really driven by entirely that projected in-year surplus or deficit of $1.1 million that has the effect of drawing that bar down. And then into the future, what you see happen is, a little bit of crystal ball gazing that we are sort of projecting out, but with very, very little data, that hopefully we can continue to grow to some extent that surplus, should the trustees choose to make that a priority, and if not, we'll proceed accordingly based on our operating budgets. So in summary, financial and forecast number 2 anticipates a $1.1 million in-year deficit. That's obviously down from the $0.2 million surplus we originally projected in the original budget, but quite a significant improvement from the $2.9 million deficit we were projecting in January. Again, we're projecting a deficit, but it still is based on a somewhat risk-averse approach to assessing the financial impacts. So we are trying to be conservative. We don't want to be in a situation where the deficit spirals out of control or to a point where it really depletes our ability to respond throughout the course of the year. So we're trying to be reasonably conservative. With respect to, and as we reported earlier this month, we haven't seen really significant new cost pressures emerging. So the things that like sick leave and so on, PPE purchasing that we see being, we originally identified as being cost pressures, continue to be cost pressures, and they don't appear to be deviating materially from what our original projections are. And in fact, to some extent, some of them are getting a little better. As I mentioned this evening, the PPE burn rate that we're seeing is somewhat better than we had originally projected, and we've adjusted our forecast accordingly. And finally, like many other boards in similar situations, the currently projected deficit remains within our ministry compliance threshold. It would be balanced, and we would essentially balance it in quotes at year end by drawing down the board surplus, but that would leave approximately $10 million in our accumulated surplus available for compliance, which we substantially use precisely for this kind of thing where you have unanticipated financial pressures emerging through the course of the year, and that's how we keep the tiller steady and the ship moving forward without undue disruption. And again, what we're still going to continue forecasting and monitoring, taking a reasonably conservative stance as we proceed through the school year. And that represents my presentation for this evening. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Executive Superintendent Hobbs. I would like to make a comment or a question, I guess. So we have a $1.1 million projected deficit, which is still compliant, and it's an improvement from the 2.9 million deficit, which was projected in forecast number 1. So there are many moving parts. So am I right to assume that in forecast number 3, which is a precursor to our budget for 2021-22, that we could be in pretty good shape?
I think just a couple points. Yes, you could be in better shape. That's definitely a possibility. And I think too that generally speaking, financial forecast number 3 comes right at the tail end of budget. Actually, ironically, but in previous years, I think that I would say in the past few years, there has been a pattern where things have improved slightly between financial forecast number 2 and number 3. But again, I think we're really mindful of just the sheer uncertainty that we're facing this year, and wanting to remain conservative without trying to predispose the results.
Thank you very much. Trustees, do you have any questions or comments? Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
Yes, my question is, we have a planning session this weekend. I'm wondering if this presentation, if we could discuss this further with Superintendent Hobbs. I have many questions about this, such as, can additional PPE be purchased for staff, such as face masks? Now we have face shields because we have variants of concerns. Where should we spend our money? We're looking into the new school year now. What are we going to do? We don't know yet, and we have to have direction. I know we're waiting for the direction from the government as well, but I'd like some of this to be brought forward to our meeting on Saturday. Thank you.
Trustee Swan, I believe that is possible as a discussion point, but not as an action point.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Hearing none, ladies and gentlemen, Director, is there any further action required on this agenda item?
Mr. Chair, through you, no, it was an update report. It was to ensure that staff met its commitment to be providing 3 financial forecasts to the board, so we're 2/3 of the way there. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, the next financial forecast would be in June, financial forecast number 3, and that would be giving the board the closest look at what staff anticipate is the wrap up to the 2020-2021 budget for August 2021.
Thank you very much, Director. We are now going to go back, if we could, to the technical glitch that we had with the report of Superintendent Coombs with regard to the equity and inclusion plan update. Superintendent Coombs and Director, would you be available?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Coombs is back online, and just again as a lead up for Mr. Coombs, again, the board has a variety of plans that it uses to intentionally shape the future that it wishes through concrete actions. The equity and inclusion plan that you're hearing this evening is a report out on the finality of implementing the 2018-2020 plan. And as I mentioned earlier, Mr. Chair, in my previous comments, certainly the focus on equity, inclusion, on the efforts of all organizations, including school boards, schools, and school districts to address anti-racism and inclusivity has been significant, and there has been an awakening certainly in terms of those key roles and how to make concrete actions materialize in organizations, in schools, and in classrooms. So tonight, Mr. Chair, Mr. Coombs will comment on our board's efforts thus far from the past 2 years, and then give some insights about planning for the next plan, 2021 to 2023. So I'll turn it over to Superintendent Coombs then, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Director. Mr. Chair, through you, and I apologize for the glitch, and thank you for your patience. I am going to give a brief summary of our board plan from the past 3 years, and certainly focusing upon our activities over the past 12 months. You know, it was interesting. I was reflecting on the past year, and the last time I presented to this board on equity was March 13th, 2020. You may remember 24 hours later, we were in a lockdown. And so certainly everything that I'm going to be discussed today has been impacted by the events of the past 12 months. You know, our focus, of course, over the past year has been, you know, the health and safety of our students and our staff, certainly trying to create a hybrid model of learning delivery and keeping students engaged. That has been our focus. But certainly, I would say that the pandemic has really highlighted the importance of equity and inclusion. And I would say certainly coming out of that pandemic in a post-pandemic world, equity and inclusion will be a critical element to the success of our students and to this board. I'm going to comment briefly on 7 deliverables which have been identified as part of our plan, and then at the end I will be making some recommendations going forward, recognizing that this is the last time that I will be addressing the board, at least on equity, and next week, of course, my very capable colleague, Superintendent McNair, will be taking over the equity portfolio. I'm going to start with our key deliverable number 1, which was the implementation and awareness of religious accommodation. Our action status currently is progressing. We certainly have done a lot of training on awareness for school administrators regarding Policy 451. We've included the use of case studies in that training. We've also included religious accommodation in our self-assessment practices, which I'll be talking about momentarily. You know, 80% of our school leaders believe that their staff is well aware of Policy 451 and its application in the classroom. However, over the past year, only half of our administrators are familiar or at least aware of a religious accommodation request having been made. I would consider that the next steps for this would be continued building awareness, certainly additional training as we come out of this pandemic, which enables us to do more training and certainly more face-to-face training. You know, continuing to build awareness also in our new to the role teachers and new to the role leaders. And we are holding sessions on this most recently, just a couple of days ago, to our aspiring school leaders group. Certainly religious accommodation will continue to be an important part of what we do going forward. Key deliverable number 2 is a review of our human resources practices. We do have a subcommittee of our equity committee. It's a human resources team, which has been looking at its hiring practices to make sure that it aligns with board policy as well as compliance with the Ontario Human Rights Code. And we do have a new draft hiring policy currently that is being worked on and should be coming to the board in the next few months. Key deliverable number 3 is a review and an implementation of equity components of our appraisal process. That means both teacher, principal, and supervisory officer performance appraisal. This is a progressing action, and it was a bit of a casualty of the pandemic in that appraisals themselves have been put on hiatus through this pandemic. However, we do have the documentation and the training ready to go, and that will be something that we will need to focus upon as we return to some semblance of normalcy in the fall and beyond. Our fourth key indicator was reviewing and establishing a self-assessment tool to allow for self-reflection of our leaders as well as our school equity and inclusion teams. This is completed. We have been through multiple, a variety of different self-assessment tools. We have piloted those in a number of schools, and we do believe now we do have an assessment tool that we are happy with and is functional, and we have been using it at least a couple of times over the course of the last 12 months to see how we're doing in relation to the pandemic. And certainly, as we were saying before, the equity component really has come to life during this time. I do say, however, I am cautious about this because I believe that tool, while we do have a tool that has gone through a variety of different iterations, it is going to have to be changed on an ongoing basis. It will have to be reviewed and certainly responsive to changing circumstances. And just a note, we have included that assessment tool as part of our entry and exit plans for principal and leadership and part of our leadership training as well. Key deliverable number 5. This is something you're going to hear a lot about next year going forward. It's about building a more robust data cycle that will allow us to see how our most vulnerable populations are doing. And we have been doing a lot of work on this over the last few years. I think it was a couple of years ago, I did a presentation on equity, and I was presenting about a student census which asked students to identify themselves as members of the LGBTQ community, and then we were able to take that and look at what their sense of feeling welcomed in our schools, what their sense of anxiety, depression might be, their sense of belonging, and that was really important data. The data themselves, the results themselves weren't surprising when you consider provincial and national data to compare it to. I believe it was the student trustee who asked a question of me saying, well, how are those kids doing in school? And of course, at the time, I had to say, I don't know. I don't know what their graduation rate is like. I don't know how successful they are being. And so our new student census, which will make us compliant with the anti-racism data standards, is just about ready to go. It's in draft form. It needs to go we need to have some pretty extensive consultation going forward. We have to be able to orient our schools, our students, our parents, our communities, because we are going to be asking questions around vulnerable populations, questions of race, visible minorities, LGBTQ status, and other identifiers. The difference this time is that we are then going to have the capacity to correlate that data with achievement data. And so probably this time next year, there will be a report coming to the board, which will be able to say not just how our students are perceived or what their perception is, for example, visible minority students within our schools, not just what their perception of how they're doing, but actually how they are doing. And so what's their graduation rate? What's their attendance rate? What about suspension, expulsion, and exclusion data, EQAO data? We'll be able to really get granular with our achievement data and enable us to take really targeted action because this is an annual process. And so as we get better, as we receive more of that kind of data, we'll be able to apply some strategies and then measure our impact on an ongoing basis. By the way, this will make us compliant with the ARDS, and all school boards in Ontario must be compliant with that legislation by the fall of 2023. We do see the next steps being the student census being administered in the fall of 2021, and again, a report coming back to this table sometime early in the following year. Our sixth deliverable was providing training on and awareness of equity-related policies and procedures to all employees of the board. This is a progressing action item. We have made some inroads in this, and we have certainly providing this kind of training to our new to the role, to our aspiring to the role, and to our school leadership. We do see the next step for this being pushed out into all new employees of the board, and you really see this as an opportunity. As we emerge out of the pandemic and we begin focusing on other priorities, I think this will really be assist us in moving forward, not just some of the specific equity-related policies I have spoken to tonight, but also all the other ancillary ones that are connected with that. And finally, number 7, a key implementation was the procedure for support and accommodation of transgender and gender non-conforming students. I am pleased to say that this procedure, which has gone extensive vetting, many iterations and lots of input, is now no longer draft and is certainly on the books as a support procedure for policy 454. We will need to, again, do more awareness training on this going forward, but that procedure has gone from draft to completed. And this brings me to our next steps and recommendations. And, over the past 3 years that I've had this portfolio, it really has been great to be able to engage with schools, with teachers, with students, and with colleagues. But really over the past 3 years, we have really looked at the issues around equity and inclusion and diversity with internally within ourselves. We really haven't extended our reach beyond the Upper Canada District School Board, although we have made some good partnerships with some municipalities and with some advocacy groups. Our recommendation going forward, instead of coming and simply presenting a draft form of a next iteration of a 3-year plan, we are recommending that we do conduct an external review, and that would mean bringing somebody in with an expertise in equity, diversity, and inclusion, who would look at our policies, our procedures, and our culture with new eyes, with fresh eyes, with an external view. Sometimes it's really hard to see the things which are right in front of you, especially if you've been with the board and worked with the board for a long period of time. And so similar to what we did with the external review of our special education programming, most recently 2017 and 18, the product of that was some really targeted recommendations and suggestions which really helped us move our spec ed programming forward in a really positive way. And in that same regard, I think a recommendation to do something similar for equity would give this board a really solid footing to move forward and to grow into and to grow into the next few years when again post-pandemic world, equity will continue to be even more so an incredibly important indicator of the success of us as an organization. And with that, I will take any questions you may have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Coombs. Trustees, would you have any questions or comments?
I've got one.
Go ahead, Trustee McPherson.
Thank you. Last week, it was my privilege to attend the second half of the racism training for school board trustees. One of the things I found particularly interesting was the breakout sessions, where we ended up with about 11 other trustees in the virtual room with each other. Every board's approaching this slightly differently, which is no big surprise. And a lot of opinions, a lot of different ways of dealing with it. My question to you is, when you make reference to vulnerable populations, does that extend to those who come from a challenged social economic background? I'm talking more of their how would you put it, their family income status, the working poor. Does that taken into consideration?
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. That's a great question. Yes, it does. Some of the standards which need to be addressed are socioeconomic standards. Obviously, the questions which we ask have to be sensitive. So there are questions of, for example, whether you have high-speed Wi-Fi in your home, whether you have, how many devices do you have, tablets, computers, and such. And so it does, there are several questions just under socioeconomic, which will help report out on the impact of poverty, and certainly in Eastern Ontario, rural poverty, and its impact on student achievement. And so, so yes, economic status and socioeconomic status. We do have this data, by the way, for communities, and certainly if you've looked at the school profiles, which anyone can look at on our website, you can see that. But this will give us very specific data, targeted data, that'll come directly from students themselves.
Thank you very much. I have a question from Trustee Petition.
Great, thank you. Through you, Chair. I will see if my connection maintains, and if you have any issues hearing me, let me know, and I can always text my questions after. Superintendent Coombs, I want to thank you very much for your presentation. It was very good. I was looking forward to it. I just sort of have a question, because I know your presentation was a little bit more high level, but are we as a board looking at areas that we would identify a student just as a student, and no longer necessarily identifying a student by their gender or by their choice that they identify as? Are we looking at that sort of in an area of either a questionnaire or training that teachers are getting?
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I might be able to paraphrase just so I understand the question, do you mean, does the data come directly from students, or can we then, no, I may not be understanding the question.
That's okay. I'll try to put it a different way. We sometimes identify students based either on their gender or put them in a category. We're asking them to identify, you know, if they are, what they're, oh, I got disconnected again. Looks like I got disconnected again. Let me try that one more time, sorry. I'm looking at a way, are we as a board working towards, I guess, with the reports that you're doing and the surveys that you're doing and the work that we're doing on equity inclusion, a way that we wouldn't necessarily ask students to identify either as male, female, transgender, but we would just ask them to identify as a student of our board? You know, sort of stepping away from that identification, but just being a student of the UCDSB.
Thank you very much, Trustee. Yes, through you, Mr. Chair. I understand, and that is actually part of the process that we are engaging right now with the draft census. And so, first of all, every question there at the very beginning, there of course is a consent understanding that number one, this is protected data, because I think it's really important to point out that this census that we are collecting, while it is confidential, it is not anonymous. And because it's not anonymous, that's how we actually can then connect it with their achievement data from PowerSchool, from the information that we seek. So the first question is, do you consent to this? And here's all the different things we do to make sure that your data is confidential. But every question after that, it can, number one, can be skipped. so they can refuse to answer or just I choose not to answer. And with the identification of whether they are gender specific, they are able at this point at least to skip that question. It just means that that would not be included in the data that we would collect. So for example, if we were looking at students that are transgender or identify as transgender, we would be able to take the data from that and then link that to say, the report will be our students who identify as transgender, here is how they are doing. So here's their graduation rate, here's their attendance rate, and here's other indicators of success that we have. So yes, they can skip a question. I don't know, and I'm trying to think. We just had about an hour and a half session today working on the draft census, and so I will have to go back and look at that specific one to see if they can just check off and say I'm a student. But I should point out also, once the draft is completed, and our draft is just about completed at this time, it's going to be going out for very extensive consultation, and so you will see a draft. Our communities will see a draft. Parents, students. And in fact, this would be a part of a consultant's job, is to assist us in making sure that this stakeholder survey has been thoroughly vetted and thoroughly lots of input be given. I should note that there are 3 or 4 other boards that have just done this census this year, and so we have their censuses. So we're having a lot of really exciting conversations around why each board has chosen the questions that they have. And so I've made a note of that, and that's a very good point.
Great, thank you. Chair, I have one more question or comment, if it's possible.
Absolutely, go ahead, Trustee.
Perfect. As the Superintendent Coombs mentioned, it would by next week, Superintendent McNair would be taking over for him in this role. But I did have a question for him, maybe with the work that he's done thus far on equity and inclusion. Maybe he can also pass it on to Superintendent McNair. That how can we as trustees of the UCDSB improve our equity and inclusion sort of training, or I know we're taking external training, but as a board together, have training discussions, and maybe at one of our upcoming trustee sessions that we could, speak together and sort of have this type of discussion with the facilitator.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair, I would say that's an excellent idea, and I know a lot of boards are spending a particular amount of time on this. As I said, it's a one of the reasons by recommending having someone external coming in to look at this is because generally we it's always good to get outside fresh viewpoint of us. Because we always miss the things again that that perhaps we see all the time and we don't recognize it for what it is. I think it's an excellent idea.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Chair, Mr. Chair, John McCrae, may I ask a question?
By all means.
Thank you. Well, I guess it's I think Trustee Perezian sort of brought it up. I read a long article, and if I can summarize, it was inclusion and equity. If I can try and summarize it, inclusion and equity are a wonderful thing, and more power to the. But the suggestion was that we should think of that as a midpoint. That once students think of themselves just as students, it should be a midpoint, and then where do we all go? I'm just trying to. Get an understanding in my mind as well, but to make the comment that we shouldn't make it as an end goal so much as put it in place to our satisfaction and then really take off. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are there any other questions?
Trustee Swan, please.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I'm just wondering, we do this survey, we find out how people identify themselves. So what are we going to do when we get the answers with educational programming? Thank you.
I think I could answer that. It's premature but assuming that the external resource person will come back with some recommendations to the board, then it would be up to us as a board and, you know, with staff input to decide how we are going to proceed with those recommendations. And I hope we would. Not all, but some, or, you know, whatever we decide. Does that answer your question? Does that help at all?
It helps a little, but really, I mean, this is where our country's coming to, or our gender's coming to, our youth is coming to, is identifying as who they are. And I think we need to support them in school and programs, and I think we need to teach our children that about gender. But I mean, that's a programming issue I know that could come from the province, but it could also come from a board using provincial curriculum. So that's just what I'm saying, is to let people know that all is all and all are included and inclusive, and it's an inclusive school community. So thank you.
Yeah, good point. Let's not prejudge the report or the recommendations, and then we can go from there. But you raise a good point, Trustee Swan.
Mr. Chair.
Trustee McDonald, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on your point and Trustee Swan's point. I think, you know, the information that's gathered, if we go back to our discussion around our strategic plan and our board work plan, the cycle associated to that is collecting data and analyzing the information within the board. And this information will and can and should become part of our discussion as we move forward. As we see information like this come forward, and it's valuable information to ensure that we align our priorities and our actions to the data that we receive and the data that we collect and meet the needs of students. So that cycle is built into what we do, and it's not a one-off and doing it separately. We build it into what we would have. And I think that that the work that's being done around the other culture surveys that we have leads to, you know, lends itself to this, and this will also assist us on how we're moving forward. I will say that the board work plan right now initiated a lot of our priorities around wellness, which will encompass and should encompass a lot of the pieces that we've talked about tonight.
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? I just want to comment, if I could, in conclusion, as enlightened as I think I am, I'm aware of my own ignorance to a certain extent on the complexities that are involved in this whole thing. And I'm really pleased with our ongoing PD for trustees, as well as for our staff. I'm extremely pleased that, thanks to Trustee Cram and his committee, that our policies are updated and current. We are gathering data based on our surveys. You know, we sometimes don't know what we don't know. And if we listen, we'll learn more. So we are listening. Our antennae are raised to a heightened extent right now, and we are availing ourselves of various resources. We are prepared to act, and this external review, I think, is an excellent opportunity. So I think we were on the right track, trustees. So that just is my perspective as chair. If there are no further comments, we are going to move. Thank you very much, Superintendent Coombs, for your report. Your last report, at least on this issue, but I suspect we will be calling on you before you disappear into the sunset of retirement. So please stay tuned. So we are now going to go to 1403, which is the development of a board policy for accessibility of menstrual hygiene products in Upper Canada District School Board schools. And I am now going to turn this over to, I believe, Trustee Petition, am I right? Yes. And student trustee. Hey, Ting, go ahead, please.
That's correct. Thank you very much, Chair. Through you, through meeting with our student trustees, and an item came to the table for us to have discussion, and here it was. Our student trustees sort of met with their student population, had discussions, and saw a need that our board could fill and could bring forth a motion for the policy committee to review. So potentially, I think right now is I'll go ahead and read the motion and then allow student trustee Hughes to speak further on it, if that is all right with you, Chair.
Well, perhaps I will read the motion and then we can proceed from there.
Perfect. You can go ahead and read the motion.
It's moved by Trustee Petition, seconded by Trustee Cram. Whereas menstrual products are essential to the health and well-being of persons who require them, and whereas the Upper Canada District School Board has as one of its strategic priorities wellness, defined as caring and supportive environments that foster individual wellness and a sense of belonging for students and staff. Whereas our student trustees have identified an issue regarding students being able to equitably access female hygiene products in the Upper Canada District School Board schools. Whereas a study by Plan International Canada has identified that, and I quote, 33% of women under 25 have struggled to afford menstrual products for themselves, end of quote. Be it resolved that the Upper Canada District School Board of Trustees refer the issue of accessibility and menstrual hygiene products in the Upper Canada District School Board schools to the Policy Committee for consideration and report back to the board by April 28th, 2021. Would you proceed with your support of this motion, Trustee Petition?
Yes, I do. And I do invite student trustee Hughes to talk further on the subject.
Trustee Evans and I will both be speaking.
Great.
Student trustee Evans and I were made aware of a possible issue with the supply of quality and awareness of feminine hygiene products in the Upper Canada District School Board. We then started an inquiry into this issue.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So just to give some background, so Trustee McCrae brought this up to both Tane and I, and we decided to further inquire on it. We had multiple meetings with Superintendent McNair about this issue of feminine hygiene products in schools. One of the meetings did include 6 different guidance counselors and multiple of our superintendents. Basically, the results from those meetings did tell us that we don't necessarily have a lack of supply, but we have kind of a lack of awareness with our students. So hopefully we hope to get out of the policy that our students will kind of know more about it and hopefully spread the information that they learn about it. And I'll turn it back to student trustee Hughes.
With that, I guess we sort of want to end our portion on a less logistical note. This motion will possibly not just be a policy being set in place, but rather a step towards further progressiveness. I speak not only as a student trustee or the student voice, but as a woman. As some of you may know, this is National Women's History Month, and it is also a milestone in women's rights in Canada. On March 7th, the Toronto Youth Advisory Committee announced a petition to make feminine hygiene products free in all public schools across Ontario. School boards across the province are passing similar policies to ours, and if not, most likely already have. And across Canada, more and more government-funded organizations are supporting the fight for free feminine hygiene products. This is not just a motion or a policy, this is a human rights issue and a necessity. I'm proud to be representing a school board that will hopefully be supporting the solution, and I hope that as female rights takes a frontline issue, we continue to grow and evolve to support it. Thank you.
That is wonderful. Thank you both, Student Trustee Evans and Student Trustee Hughes. Chair McAllister, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Parizien. And thank you, student trustees, for your enlightenment and direction on this issue. Trustees, you have a motion, and the motion I just want to reiterate is that the board refer the issue of accessibility of menstrual hygiene products in Upper Canada schools to the policy committee for consideration. So this will be brought back to us on April 28th as a formal motion. Do you have any further comments or questions, trustees?
I have a question, Trustee Swan.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
I'm just a bit confused between the two student trustees' comments. Do we not have them available in our schools is my first question, and then I have a secondary. For free, I'm saying.
I will turn that question over to Director Csba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, through you. And now on behalf of Superintendent McNair, who's not here today, but has briefed me along the way about her meetings with Trustee Evans and Trustee Hughes and Trustee Cram as well, and Trustee Parizien. We do have the products available. To the point raised by Trustee Evans, however, we have two challenges. One is about knowledge about their availability, and the second element is about what do we need to do to increase that awareness. And so part of that solution is about ensuring that there is a, if I understand the dialogue and where it rests right now, ensuring that there is a consistency in terms of how each school approaches the placement of the products and makes students aware of the products. So I'll just pause there and wait for Trustee Hughes, Trustee Evans, or Trustee Parizien to correct me if I'm off base on that.
Hi, it's Student Trustee Evans. I think that was very well said, and that reflected what was said in our meetings quite nicely.
Chair, I have a comment.
Yes, proceed, please.
Thank you, Chair. I certainly support sending it to the policy committee to come up with a policy for us for equitable distribution, I suppose, or accessibility. I think the director was very honest and straightforward where the issue is. It's not that the products aren't available, they are. They may not be accessible, or people know where they're accessible. I know within the schools in my area, and discussing it with some of the principals, some schools have signs in the washrooms as to where they can be assessed and so on. That was an initiative of one of the students' councils. Some schools have policies that say they're available if you know that they're available. Other schools don't even know if they are available or not. Some principals were becoming aware of the fact that it was an issue. So I think we're all over the place in it, and certainly I think if we have a policy, it would be well with our stuff to do that. The other issue I was having with it is we do have some schools in our board, particularly at the 7-8 level, that are not in not 7 to 12 formats. They're in with the elementary schools, and I think they are disadvantaging some of our intermediate students who in high schools may know where they can go to get them, depending on how it's publicized, but not necessarily being done in the intermediate schools. So I think it's well worth us trying to look at some way of making it universally acceptable.
Thank you very much, Trustee Cram.
I just have a final comment.
Go ahead.
I just want to thank our student trustees for bringing this one forward, because this is so important in an equity inclusion setting. I'm sure male and female students all believe in this, and I just thank you guys for bringing this forward, because it is so important and it should be in all our schools equitably. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any
Mr.
further
Chair?
comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I have a comment.
Go ahead, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you. I want to just address the issue of what we're trying to accomplish here, and I want to, although I'm on the policy committee and I'm also on audit committee, which reviews adherence to policy, I don't think we need a policy for this. My understanding is that we have it in place, but the problem is that there's an awareness associated to it. Having a policy doesn't change that. I think what we need to do is forego the policy, and as of today, create an awareness policy, awareness campaign that we make sure that students are aware that this is available. We don't have a policy that says we have to have paper towels in our washrooms as well to dry hands. So this is just a fact that we need to move forward on. This is something that administration can do and should do today. We don't need a policy to be able to do this. I think it's something that's the right thing to do. We should do it, but the awareness campaign needs to happen today, not after a policy. And I think by only doing that, we're just kind of sugarcoating the whole process to make sure that we have a policy. But the problem still exists that we have an awareness lack or a deficiency around awareness to make sure that students are aware that it's there and available for them. And I think that needs to start tomorrow. And let's just move on. Let's make sure that it's there so that we can assist and make sure the program is available for our kids. This is not something that we need to really discuss a lot further. A policy is not going to change the awareness.
I have a secondary comment, please.
If I could just respond first to Trustee McDonald.
Yes, no problem.
I would agree, Trustee McDonald, that the issue here primarily is awareness. But by virtue of the fact that we are having this motion and this conversation has in fact achieved your goal of heightened awareness. And while I do think that the policy, it's on the books and it's there, but it does signal our attitude and our heightened awareness of the issue. That's my only comment. Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
Well, can I just follow that up, Mr. Chair?
Yes, by all means.
And I agree. I think it's great that we're talking about it tonight, but it's also not great that we're talking about it. We shouldn't have to talk about it because it should have been happening. And I think, for us to have this this level of confidence that a policy solves the problem is a false sense. And I think that's what we want to be careful of. We need to make sure that we have action associated to it, because that still has to occur even when we develop a policy. It should just be an automatic. And I think that, student trustees should be commended for bringing it forward, but I don't know that we need to delay it any further. I think we should be moving forward on the action tonight. That's what I'm getting at, is let's not delay it. Let's not put it in the form of a policy, because it needs to happen. It should happen. And it should be just automatic within every school.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's a great comment.
Trustee
Swan, did you have a question?
Yes, I do think we need a policy. These student trustees brought this forward. It's a problem in the schools, obviously, and I think we need a policy so the board administration can bring forward a procedure for this. Obviously, it's a problem. We need a policy for administration to bring forward a procedure. It's obviously not happening consistently in our schools, and we need it to happen. And it's so important for all women who need hygiene products to be able to access them without embarrassment. with knowing where to go and everything else. And I'm sorry, David. Like, anyway, I'm not going to say what I was going to say, but anyway, I think this is important, and I would recommend this to go to the policy committee. I would actually have liked this to be passed tonight.
All right, we have a motion though, and I'm going to move to Student Trustee Evans, followed by Vice Chair McPherson.
Hi, so through you, Chair, I think the thinking behind the policy was we wanted a little bit of a more of a consistent approach to this issue from school to school, because we did have meetings with guidance counselors, and it wasn't consistent. Like some of these products would be in the office, or some schools had them out in bathrooms. So I just wanted to let everyone know that the thinking behind the policy was that we could maybe have a more consistent approach throughout all our schools, so all students who need these products can get them. Whether there's a policy or whether there's an awareness campaign, as long as, you know, at the end of the day, students who need this product can figure out how to get them.
Thank you. Vice Chair?
Thank you. I do understand where Trustee McDonald's coming from. But this is just plain common sense. And I would support it going to the policy committee on the understanding that staff would develop an accompanying procedure. Policy dictates what, procedure dictates how. And if I believe it's the 28th of April we're talking about, we get to the 28th of April, I would like to see not only the board's response in the form of a policy, but the administration's response and how they're going to deliver it and increase the awareness, increase the awareness within our communities that this is available and on a consistent basis. And we do it with a lot of other things. We do it with transportation. We do it with special education, that it is all treated the same across the board. So just my comment.
Thank you.
I have a last comment, if I may.
Go ahead, Trustee Smalley.
I just want to say that I am aware of a student that didn't go to school because of the parental situation and the funding in the house. She had no access to feminine hygiene products, so she stayed home from school for a week because she could not access them. So I think if we have any policy put in place, this will help our student learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have I missed anyone?
I just have one last comment.
Go ahead, Trustee Kaiser.
Perfect. Thank you. Through you, Chair. My comment is the reasoning behind the policy was that we could stay consistent, you know, moving forth, right? So it's wonderful to have you know, we go out and we bring all this awareness to our schools, and then times change and times, you know, move forward, move on. If we don't have the policy there to back them up afterwards, then, you know, we could be where we are now 10 years later. So at least the policy will be able to be there with the procedure moving forth.
Thank you. Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to come back and remind trustees that a policy is a high level statement. The procedure is what gets done, right? That's the administrative work, and we don't control that. What I'm proposing is that let's simply pass a motion tonight that every female washroom have dispensers installed and they be filled on a consistent basis. You don't need a policy to say that. And that's kind of where I'm coming back from. We get a false sense of security when we say have a policy in so that you have consistency. The problem is that we've heard from other reports is that we don't have consistency sometimes with policy because we need to make sure that everyone is aware of the policy. We need to make sure that people are following the procedure. Simple statement, we have washrooms, we have toilet paper, we have paper towels in them. Now we're going to install feminine hygiene dispensers and products in every female washroom. That's the motion. that's what we do, and that becomes standard operating procedure on how we run our secondary or our intermediate schools. That's just what we need to do, and that's the message that we need to send to our system by having these installed and filled on a consistent basis. The policy doesn't do that, and that's what we need to be careful of. The policy, you know, it's a nice pie in the sky statement, we can do it, but we still got to put the action behind it. So, you know, putting a motion on the table tonight to say, install the dispensers and have them filled on a regular basis. This is what's accomplishing the gap that the student trustees have talked about tonight by saying that there isn't an awareness. Some are kept in one location, some are kept in another location. Let's stop that. Let's put them in the washrooms and make it accessible.
Mr. Chair, may I come?
No, just a moment, please. Trustee McDonald, you know that I am very aware of your knowledge of procedure and whatnot. You are really not speaking to the motion. If you would like to speak or present a motion after this one, I would gladly entertain it to that effect. But that is not the motion. Trustee McRae?
I guess you have covered it. I'll pass.
Trustee Swan had a question.
Trustee Swan?
Yes, I mean, I understand what you're saying. Trustee McDonald was not addressing the motion. He was putting forward a second motion. But I would just say, I would like to see a motion come forward. I don't know why we have to wait a month to do this, but my big but is, I'm not talking about my own but anyway, is the fact that I would like to see there be some kind of monetary 10 cents. I mean, somebody can borrow a dime or something, because I have a fear of putting, I like Trustee McDonald's idea of putting them in the washrooms for free, but I can see them being misused, unfortunately. So I would like to see a small monetary contribution to get some sanitary supplies out. So anyway, that's just my idea, but I would like to pass a secondary motion tonight to allow this or take it to policy. But I mean, does it have to be a policy? It's the right thing to do. I mean, I'm just saying anyway where I'm coming from. So thank you.
Can I speak to that, Chair McAllister?
Who is speaking here?
Trustee Evans, Student Trustee Evans.
Yes, go ahead, Trustee. Go ahead.
So Trustee Swan, that actually did come up in our meeting with the guidance counselors, and we had an interesting comment from one of our guidance counselors, and it was, so contraceptives in our schools are not at any cost, and although sometimes staff will be picking them up after they've been misused in the hallways, we kind of came to a conclusion that the benefit to having them out is way more than the downfall to having some students misuse the products. I just wanted to put that out there.
Okay, trustees, can I give you as a chair some direction here? One is that we pass this motion now, and secondly, I would entertain a second motion from Trustee McDonald with regard to his intent. And I don't think the two are contradictory. One would take effect almost immediately. The other would supplement it with some policy and some practice and some procedure. Trustees, do you have my agreement on that?
Question?
Trustee Swan?
So we passed the motion that's on the table, but then how is the second motion brought back that Trustee McDonald brought, that we just have it in all schools, which is my understanding?
Well, we just bring it back after we pass this motion.
Okay, thank you.
Trustees, I'm going to proceed to the vote on the motion on the table. which essentially is, be it resolved that the Upper Canada District School Board of Trustees refer the issue of accessibility of menstrual hygiene products in the Upper Canada District School Board schools to the Policy Committee for consideration and report back to Board by April 28th, 2021. So we will vote on this motion now.
I can't bring it up, so I'm voting in favor of it.
Trustee Barry in favor. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'm awaiting the results from Ms. Workman. Motion is carried from Ms. Workman's perspective. So as I said, the motion has now been carried, and I would entertain a second motion. So over to you, Trustee McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like a motion to be passed or to be read tonight to call for the installation of, and perhaps I'm using the inappropriate wording, but feminine hygiene product dispensers in every female washroom or unisex washroom in the Upper Canada District School Board, and that those dispensers be filled on a regular basis.
Thank you.
I second it.
Any further discussion?
I have a comment, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Trustee McCray.
Thank you. I think this is something that comes back to what Trustee McPherson said. I think we should be hearing the how well founded this is from the 4 trustees that have brought this forward, that the what of it would go to the committee. The how of it should be something that staff would bring forward to that committee and or to the full board. I just like the way that works. It may come out that they will be in all washrooms across the board, but in this case, I think that it would be the best policy would be starting with the policy committee looking at it so that it is explicit in a policy that we support this, but how it comes out would be given up by staff. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm confused, though. I just wanted to clarify. Are you speaking for or against the motion?
Against.
Thank you.
Chairman.
Any further comments? Yes.
Yes. I think we just passed a motion and now you've got one that's contradictory. It says all washrooms. Well, does that include JK to 6? We talked about accessibility in schools. We didn't talk about installing machines. Maybe it's going to be through the office. The biggest problem here is awareness. And I'm sorry, I kind of like the idea of it going to policy where it would be well thought out, all the possibilities are considered, and if the policy committee follows in their standard practice, they will bring back to us a usable and a sensible policy, accompanied by a procedure that will give us some guidance into how we're going to make it look and how we're going to make it work. So I'm sorry, I think that the motion that we've already passed has addressed the issue, and this one is kind of contradicting ourselves 3.5 minutes after we just finished discussing the other one.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments?
I do.
We have a motion. Go ahead, Trustee Petition.
Sorry, I guess there was just a little, I wanted maybe a friendly amendment to Trustee McDonald's motion. I'm reading it now, but I believe when he had said, female and gender neutral washrooms, I just maybe if it was specific, it was high school, and made sure also that our intermediate schools that had, students from grade 5 to grade 8, they could have access to it, that would not have to go to the office. So to access it. But otherwise, that was my only recommendation, that we were specific in that area to make sure that our K-8 schools were also covered in this motion.
I think if I could, Trustee Petition, the motion is that dispensing machines for menstrual hygiene products be installed in all female washrooms and gender neutral washrooms.
I have a question, Mr. Chair, as well.
All right, just a moment, please.
Sure.
Am I correct, Trustee Petition? All?
All, yeah, except for, I guess, we wouldn't need any in the JK areas of the schools if they have a designated area. We'd use our proper judgment in that.
Trustee Evans, go ahead.
I was just wondering if we should be including what type of dispensing machines we're installing, whether or not students need to be inserting any kind of money into them.
I'm going to answer that question if I could, please. That is why we have a procedure as opposed to a policy. That is the how, the policy is the what.
Okay.
So that is my ruling on that. Trustee McDonald?
Yeah, I agree. My intention with the motion is that there would be no fee.
Absolutely. Thank you. Are there any further questions or comments? I'm going to read the motion and ask you to vote that dispensing machines for menstrual hygiene products be installed in all female washrooms and gender neutral washrooms at Upper Canada District School Board schools. Please cast your ballot.
I vote against the motion. Barry?
Mr. Chair, noted. Trustee Barry against the motion. And Mr. Chair, you'll note that Trustee Evans would like it recorded that he's in favor of the motion, which is permissible under the role of the student trustee. They are not counted for or against, but they are noted on where they would stand on the motion.
Thank you. I also would like to note that on the previous motion, I received a text here that student trustee Tane Hughes voted in favor. Correct me if I'm wrong. I just wanted to put that on the record. So,
duly noted, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the first motion.
Thank you. So at this point, everybody has voted. I'm awaiting the results. Yes.
My apologies, Chair, if I could get my name associated with yes as well. My board computer battery just ran out, so by the time I went and got my own computer, the vote had already taken. So if I could get my vote in there as well, it'd be appreciated.
Yeah, that's fine. The vote has not been completed yet.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, we've noted that Trustee Cram is for the motion, and we've noted that Trustee Barry is against the motion. So Mr. Chair, that motion carries.
Thank you very much. Thank you to student trustees Hughes and Evans for their work on this, as well as the support of our trustee mentors, Cram and Petition. So thank you. We're now going to move to 1404, which is the K-12 program delivery planning for 2021-2022 school year. It's an update to the board. I'll pass this off to Director Sliwa to introduce his team.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everybody. Again, it's Stephen here, and I'm also co-presenting with Superintendent Susan Rudders, who together we will update you since the last time we provided a presentation to the board on the topic of how we are approaching the next school year, 2021-2022. So we'll go to the next slide, please. Key to this discussion, Mr. Chair, is we are looking at 3 scenarios, as you know, and so we'll move to slide number 2 for Superintendent Rudders. We'll move that. And the discussion on March 10th to the board was that staff over the last 8 weeks were looking at 3 different scenarios. Scenario 1 was a business as usual approach to reopen schools with no need for cohorting, but perhaps with some enhanced public health practices. Scenario number 2, however, is looking at a process where we would look at strong reduction of a co-mingling of different students from different classes. So a return to cohorting with the notion of single cohorts for our elementary students and our notion of quadmestering as we've currently been approaching this current academic year. The third scenario, however, is a hybrid of the two. And so from September to January, Mr. Chair, we were looking at the scenario that we would begin the school year with a focus on cohorting of classes, and then expect that there would be a relaxing of the requirements for cohorting and very strict public health measures to general public health measures to maintain people's well-being and general health while in schools. We'll go to the next slide, Mr. Chair, and slide number 3 speaks to the constraints and also the assumptions as we're planning for the new school year. So Superintendent Rudders is going to advance the slide deck if she wouldn't mind. And in this regard, the assumptions that are influencing our planning is fixed in what we presented to the board our last meeting. We are confirming that the variants of concern remain prevalent. As a matter of fact, in a briefing with the Chief Medical Officer of Health for the East Ontario region this afternoon, Dr. Paul had advised us that 50% of the cases that the health unit are dealing with right now is the variants of concern. So that is still a challenge to the public health landscape right now. And we are assuming that that continues to be a challenge until we have everyone vaccinated. And that's up to the phase 3 of vaccination plan that will be completed by the fall. We also know, Mr. Chair, that Ministry of Education has preferred cohorting and the emergency model for delivery of in-person learning through these methods starting from last June, and it has continued to evolve to where we are today, including the most recent update to the plan that the ministry uses, which is earlier this month. We also recognize that there is a need for some families and some of our students specifically to have remote learning as an approach for a period of the start of the new school year, and that also that there is a limited range of those options that will be needed because students' own personal health circumstances may not permit them to return to school until the entire full vaccination rollout has been completed. So we're aware of that as well. Superintendent Rudders will move to the next slide for us, and before she takes the reins here in a moment. And we also want to talk about the constraints that we know that exists. And so if you could advance the slide, please. As we mentioned, Mr. Chair, in our presentation 2 weeks earlier to the board, why the pandemic is known as in circles as a wicked problem is because there's no easy solution, and in this case, no known finish line. And so we continue to invest in the insights of science that looks at the mass vaccination as curtailing the spread and our concerns about the pandemic. We continue to listen for when that finish line would be, and we know that there's been some shifting of that now well into the fall. We also know that one of our key constraints is that we have timelines, as I was mentioning in my opening comments at the front end of this evening's meetings, around our staffing commitments and collective agreements. We want to make sure that we lock our staff into place for next year, and we need to move forward. When there is a delay, there's always consequences for the board. Everything from having to deal with any kind of penalties that might come with late staffing to public confidence that makes sure that we have the teachers, the educational workers, our principals and vice principals firmly in place in our schools and ready to go for September. You also heard from Executive Superintendent Hobbs that while we have a more optimistic forecast for the end of year financial picture, August 2021, we're still projecting a deficit. And so we need to build that in mind for when we look at designing models so that we can commit to a model that we can either scale up or scale down and not tax that deficit unknowingly or unnecessarily. And then lastly, again, recognizing that some of the models for remote learning, as you mentioned in your comments, Mr. Chair, in your presentation of a question to the Minister of Education this week, that we're recognizing that some of our models do not necessarily render a better outcome in student learning. And so what we have to do is to make sure that we commit to models that we know have that improved outcome. And what you heard from a presentation from Superintendent Coombs last board meeting on March 10th was that the closer that students are to daily schooling, whether it's synchronous or in-person learning, the greater likelihood that students will experience success. And that came from our 9 to 12 snapshot that Superintendent Coombs presented last week. So, Mr. Chair, then the next slide goes over to Superintendent Rudders then, and she'll pick up the conversation and our discussion here this evening about where we're landing in terms of the model of choice that actually allows for maximum flexibility and scalability for us as a team. So over to Superintendent Rudders.
So thank you very much. And through you, Chair, could I just confirm that you are indeed able to see the slide deck?
Slide deck is perfect, Superintendent Rudders, and we hear you loud and clear.
Great. Okay, thanks so much. So I'm just going to try and get it called up on my screen again. And just give me one moment. Okay. My apologies, I just have lost that slide on my computer. I will just project one more time, my apologies. Let's try this again.
What I could suggest, Superintendent Rudders, is we could reverse the order here. I could post the slide deck, and you could walk us through the dialogue, and that might help to remedy the gap here.
That would be most helpful. Thank you very much. Somehow when I switched screens to be able to add my my mic, I lost the connection in the slideshow. So my apologies for that, folks. So Director Sliwa will be showing us momentarily slide 5. And slide 5 will demonstrate for those watching tonight and for our trustees that we have in fact selected based on our considerations and our feedback from the ministry. We can confirm tonight that given current direction from the ministry, we believe that it's most prudent for us to plan for scenario 3 as the program delivery model for September 2021. And within this plan, as we've mentioned both in last week's presentation and the director mentioned a little bit earlier, of course, in the period from September to January next year, we would be structured with the use of quadmesters in secondary programming and with consideration for those single cohorts in elementary. But it would certainly be our hope and our intention to return to pre-pandemic operations with the continued presence of some public health measures in the second half of the school year. And that would be, of course, from February to June. We can move on to slide 6, please. So the program delivery model that we are anticipating for September 2021 is really represented in the graphic provided on this slide. And you'll see that the program options are represented in an inverse pyramid with the in-person model represented, or the in-person program represented at the top in the largest segment, as we believe that most students in Upper Canada will participate as in-person learners. The second section of the graphic, which is represented in green, is smaller than the top section and represents emergency remote learning options, which we believe may be necessary in order to serve some of our students at times throughout the fall, depending, of course, on public health circumstances. The bottom two sections of this graphic are increasingly smaller in size and represent a limited number of students who may, under exceptional circumstances, require access to a non-digital emergency remote learning option, or a second group who may require asynchronous digital remote learning for an extended period of time, perhaps even for the full year, which is beyond what we provide or would provide via emergency learning options. So as we move forward in the presentation, I'll provide some further detail on each of the program options that are represented within this graphic. So next slide, please, slide 7. So the top section of our graphic is the largest section here, and it represents the proportion of in-person learners that we anticipate will rejoin us in September. And of course, in this model, as we know, students participate in person at their community school with their peers and their teacher. And this has been consistently the learning model that most Upper Canada students selected in the current year. And numbers have fluctuated really between 79 or 80% to 82% for the most part throughout this year. Since the reopening of schools in February, just last month, we've had almost 400 elementary students return to in-person learning from remote learning options. And we do anticipate that this trend will continue to some extent over the rest of this year. And certainly we would anticipate increasingly so for September of 2021. And so by percentage, 84% of elementary students are now studying in person as compared to 79% in October. And that's a difference of 5%. We're also closely monitoring.
Excuse me, Superintendent Rudders, may I interrupt for a moment, please?
Certainly.
Certainly
through you, Chair.
But I realize that it is now 9:55. I would our bylaws call for a closure at 10 unless there is a motion to extend to maximum of 10:30. I would appreciate a mover and a seconder for a motion to extend.
Trustee Swan will move.
Seconder?
Danaher will second.
Thank you. So I would ask you to cast your ballots, please. I'm voting in favor. I'm not sure I can see the
I'm
vote
voting in
yet.
favor too. I can't. I've had some
Is there anyone
technical-
opposed? Is there anyone opposed to that? Thank you. That motion carries, I believe. So I apologize to you, Superintendent Rudders, for the interruption. Would you please proceed?
Certainly, through you, Chair, and no concerns at all about the interruption. As I was speaking about the elementary model, we're also closely monitoring the movement of our secondary students between in-person and remote learning options as we approach quadmester 4, which begins on April 20th. And as of today, actually, we will have 54 fewer students participating in the secondary virtual program in quadmester 4 as compared to quadmester 3. And these include approximately 14 students who have met their graduation requirements and will be leaving us for quadmester 4, and the rest have chosen to return to in-person learning. And so that represents approximately 7% of the secondary asynchronous students who are currently engaged in the secondary virtual program. We believe the pace of vaccinations over the coming months will certainly help families feel more secure in terms of the health risks associated with COVID-19 transmission during in-person learning. And what we hope will also be reduced health concerns as a factor. We would certainly encourage our families and our students to choose in-person learning options in September, because we know that students who are closely connected to their local school and who have daily contact with their classroom teacher enjoy greater success in learning generally than our students in asynchronous remote programs. And this is particularly true even of our asynchronous non-digital programs. And as we said a little earlier, this is evident in the secondary accredited attainment data. It's also evident in our initial examination of midterm elementary report card data. Slide 8, please. So this slide references the second tier of our learning model graphic, and that is the emergency learning options. And the elementary and secondary emergency learning options for September include synchronous digital remote learning and asynchronous digital remote learning. And we recognize that at least in the first half of the year, some students may wish to select digital remote learning should the public health conditions warrant this as an available option. Both synchronous and asynchronous digital remote learning options will be connected to the mainstream school classroom and teacher in our elementary and in our secondary programs next year. And as such, that movement between in-person, between synchronous digital and asynchronous digital models will be quite flexible. Slide 9, please. Thank you. So this slide really speaks to the non-digital option in both elementary and secondary emergency remote learning, and it's represented by the yellow section of the graphic. And after much consideration, we have determined that in the 2021-22 school year, there will be limited availability of emergency non-digital remote learning for elementary and secondary students. And as mentioned previously, our current achievement data really indicates that our students are increasingly successful when they have that direct and daily contact with their regular classroom teachers. And so while there may be some exceptions, students in asynchronous non-digital programs have demonstrated to a great extent lower levels of success overall. A process will be developed for consideration of those exceptional circumstances that might warrant access to a non-digital program for few students within our board. Slide 10, please. So beyond emergency remote learning, we certainly know that those emergency remote learning options will provide flexibility in response to public health concerns for short periods of time when students may be not able to attend in person. But we also recognize that a limited number of secondary students may require a fully digital remote learning program for the entire 21-22 school year, or a very large portion thereof. And this differs from our emergency remote learning options, where that movement back and forth between the models can happen with great flexibility. We will provide an early registration process for those few secondary students currently in asynchronous programs who may need to study from home over the long term and not as a more temporary emergency measure. Next slide, please. So the weeks ahead, we'll see the senior team focused on ensuring the implementation of this program plan for September of 2021. And our next steps include, of course, confirming secondary student need for asynchronous remote learning next year. It includes ensuring that implementation of our plan occurs within the timelines for annual staffing, as outlined in our collective agreements. And it also involves us ensuring clear communication with all stakeholders regarding the program models for students K-12 for the 21-22 school year. Next slide, please. So really that concludes our presentation, and I certainly would be open to answering any questions you may have, as I'm sure will Director Sliwa and any of my superintendent colleagues as well.
Thank you very much, Superintendent Rudders.
You're welcome.
I will open the floor to questions.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, Vice Chair McPherson. When you talk about limited access to non-digital learning, how are we proposing to accommodate the lack of a sustainable rural internet system in many of our remote areas?
Through you, Chair. I can speak to that, and then perhaps I'll invite my colleague Superintendent Hobbs to follow up in case he has additional information he'd like to share. We certainly recognize that there may be students who will require access to a device, and then of course connectivity, as you mentioned, in some of our rural areas can be an issue. Our IT department this year provided the opportunity for families to have what are called, I believe, Kijit hotspots, so like mobile internet opportunities for those areas, and that would certainly be our first, intention, I would believe, in terms of trying to accommodate those families, and then beyond that, we would need to have, if that's not possible, determine how we could accommodate programming needs, and that may be a circumstance where one of those extenuating circumstances for a non-digital consideration would in fact come into play. I'll open up just to see if Superintendent Hobbs has anything to add to that.
No, Superintendent Rudders, I don't have much to add. I think that we can certainly take steps to help where there is connectivity available to the home, but for whatever reason the family can't manage to get that connectivity. What we can't really help with is if there isn't connectivity or high-speed internet options available in the community. We just don't have the ability to build it. That would be the domain of the telcos and a whole other sort of arena other than us. But certainly, if there's connectivity to the home, we can help make those options available to the extent that that's possible.
Any further questions?
Trustee Schooler has a question.
Go ahead, Trustee Schooler.
How have these circumstances affected the implementation of a district-wide timetable?
Through you, Chair. If I could just clarify the question, you're speaking about the emergency situation we're in and the move to quadmestering. Is that correct, Trustee Schuler?
Well, yes, and through you, Chair. Sorry. Prior to the pandemic, we had spent time discussing the implementation of a district-wide timetable, and so I'm wondering if those plans have had to be put on hold, or if they continue, or if the complexities of this situation have sort of put that on hold.
So through you, Chair, yes, I can certainly provide some response on where we're at with our district-wide timetable implementation. So effective September 2021, moving forward, all of our secondary schools will be on aligned bell times. So the same start time of 8 a.m. each morning, same end bell time of 2:10. We would anticipate that moving into the fall, with our understanding that we will be structuring quadmesters, and with this opportunity for advanced planning, that we will be able to align the shifting of the classroom periods to a great extent within each school, so that period 1 falls within the same hours in each school, and period 2 falls within the same hours of each school. By the time we move to semester 2, if in our planning, things work out as we intend and as we are predicting, we would then be moving in semester 2 to our original plan for a 5-period day, and again aligning the movement of the periods and the flow of the periods across all of our 21 high schools. So that's certainly one component of the district-wide timetable. We were less able to align our quadmesters exactly by bell times this year, just because of the fact that we didn't have the same extent for advanced planning to ensure that when we were pulling this model together in late August and early September. In addition to that, one of our components of the district-wide timetable was trying to ensure that our e-learning courses across the system provided synchronous enhancement. So that scheduling of our e-learning courses in a particular period that was accessible for students at the same time across the board was more difficult to achieve this year, given the short amount of planning time that we had. We believe that we will be able to achieve for September that our e-learning courses through our day school program will all have a synchronous component, so that and they will all be scheduled specifically by quadmester period, or in second semester by 5-period day organization, and so students will be able to access them and enjoy that synchronous enhancement.
I have a question, Trustee Swan.
Go ahead, Trustee Swan.
So what is happening when the schools close down, or if we have another shutdown next quadmester, for those taking the trades, auto mechanics, construction, etc.? I know they're given an option to take another thing, but what if it happens when they're in the midst of it? What is happening to these students?
Through you, Chair. Certainly we have experienced with the emergency shutdowns that we've experienced already, we have been in a position where students were taking technology courses, hands-on courses, and ended up in a situation where they were learning remotely. Our technology teachers in particular have been participating in those instances in some sessions together. That allow them to kind of co-plan activities that can be delivered through an online format that are related to the course. In addition, particularly in our automotive technology programs, we have provided access to an electronic, a digital learning platform specific to automotive called Electude this year, and so all students have the ability to log log on and do simulated activities and engage in learning remotely in that manner. So it certainly requires some creativity on the part of our teaching staff and collaboration as well, and sharing, but we have been able to continue with the delivery of course content in remote circumstances in the past episodes when we've had a shutdown, and we certainly you know, we would never want to penalize our students and their opportunity for credit attainment in a circumstance that's really beyond their control with regards to you know, public health that causes circumstances that cause us to have to stay at home for a period of time.
I have a secondary question, and maybe it's out of line, but I'm used to that. Okay, there's a variant of concern in at least the Leeds and Grenville Health Unit that is contributing to many cases in some schools, not Upper Canada yet, but one school has 12 cases. So I'm very concerned about what are we doing as a backup plan for learning in these schools.
Trustee Swan, I understand your concern with regard to this particular issue, but I think you are off track in terms of the presentation that's being considered here. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you. Is there anyone else? Hearing none, Director Sliwa and Superintendent Rudders, I would like to thank you for your presentation. It seems to me that we have a clear direction for September 21. So I'm going to be moving on to next item, which is the Student Transportation of Eastern Ontario STAO report. And with the consent of Trustee Danaher, who is the chair of STAO this year, we are going to refer this to one of our April meetings because there's no great rush, but it will be probably in the first meeting of April. Is that satisfactory? I know that's an adjustment to our agenda. Does anyone have any concern about that? Hearing none, we will move then to report to board from private session. At its committee of the whole meeting, I hope I'm still here. Yes, I am. Okay. At its committee of the board of the whole meeting in private session, date of March 10, 2021, one personnel matter was discussed and no recommendations were brought forward to the board. Second, the next one is 1502, report to board from private session, March 24th, 2021. At its committee of the whole meeting in private session, date of March 24th, 2021, one personnel matter was discussed, and due to the time-sensitive matter, the recommendation is being brought forward to the board this evening. It's moved by Trustee Schooler, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board approve Resolution PS 2021-03 March 24-002, carried in Committee of the Whole private session under Agenda Item D1, March 24th, 2021. Would you please cast your ballots?
Trustee Danaher in support.
I'm in support. I'm sort of out of myself here right now, but that's okay. I have a motion, or at least a result here from voting is open. That motion is carried. The next is 1701. It's moved by Trustee McCray, seconded by Trustee Swan, that the Upper Canada District School Board appoints Donald Lewis as an acting supervisory officer academic, effective 07 April 2021 until 31 October 2021, subject to written confirmation of eligibility from the Ministry of Education. Please cast your ballots. I'm in favor.
Trustee Danaher in favor.
That motion is carried. I would like to personally congratulate Acting Superintendent Don Lewis, and I look forward to working with you and as I have in the past. So congratulations, Don. So at this point, we have a motion to adjourn. It's moved by Trustee McCray, seconded by Trustee Pettysiak, that the regular meeting in public session of the Upper Canada District School Board, March 24th, 2021, be adjourned at 10:17. All in favor? Any objections? Hearing none. Trustees, thank you. We've had a very extensive meeting and a very good one, and I thank you for your help and cooperation. Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everybody.